And just a bit of housekeeping beyond the mobile phones in regards to emergency exits. If there is an emergency evacuation alarm that goes off, there is all the information for the evacuation procedure and gathering point or mustering point out there on the pole. It's just towards the doors there, but put simply, the mustering point is out the back of the car park towards the railway line. But if you're not familiarise yourself with that. Also, we don't have any significantly disabled students in the class, but if anybody does become significantly disabled, unable to walk, etc., you are to wait at the top of the stairs, and the security will take you out. That I don't know exactly why that's the policy, but that's the policy that we as students don't take disabled students out to the muster area. It's the job for the security staff. Also, has everybody yet accessed Moodle or no? Or it's what's called Learn. You'll hear both those terms used interchangeably. Has anybody not yet accessed Learn?
Yeah, our system will have that. So
right. Okay. Yeah.
Trying to get on now.
Okay. Yeah. Are you having any success at the moment?
Can't get on now.
Right.
I'm getting everything else but learning.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that might take a little while, so I'll muck around after class with you for that, if that's okay. And was there anybody else that has? What's that? This particular subject. Yes. Yeah. That's what I was thinking. Yeah. So.
I've done it with the other one, but for some reason it's locked me out. I might have to log in.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Okay. Well, maybe we need to sort that out after class as well. But for each subject, you'll be given an enrolment key, and the enrolment key for this subject is it's the same as the CRN, so it's 8149. I'll just make sure that is the CRN. Yes, 8149 is your enrolment key.
If you want to do another midpoint, let's say I want to go from here to this midpoint.
Now, for those who have accessed it and for those who have it up on their screen at the moment, well, I'll bring it up on my screen, get us going with that.
Okay.
For those who have it up, you'll be brought to this page. Now, it's not essential that you have it up, have it on your own screen in this class, because I'll be working through it myself. You haven't got it at all? Yeah. What's that?
Incorrect.
Oh, 8149 is incorrect.
Yeah.
Okay. What? Actually, could somebody try typing construction with a capital C for me? Give that a go.
Yeah.
That one's worked, and it's brought up. Yeah, circle. Okay. All right. Well, then we'll use that Moodle key. I like to use the CRN because that automatically puts everybody all in the same group. It means I don't have to go in there and do that manually. But since the Moodle key is not working, the new Moodle key for this subject is construction with a capital C. So capital C. So that's our Moodle key for this subject.
So the enrolment key is 8149.
No, the Moodle key is construction with a capital C.
Yeah. If I get the right courses, I'll get those two there.
Right. Okay.
That is the right course.
This is what we're doing now.
No, that's not the right.
No, that's not the right
that's
one.
not the right sort of. So we can do.
Just search that CPPBDN.
Yeah.
Make sure you put it in the 401.
But it's actually in my courses anyway.
Have a search for CPB 4001. 4001. Yeah. So it appears you haven't been added. Yeah. So click on Now I've never done it from this end, so this will be interesting. And then enrolment key, construction with capital C. There we go.
So how do I get that out to my thing?
Well, it should be added to your thing now. That should be done that process.
Oh, yeah,
Yep.
okay, yep,
Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
thank you.
No worries. So actually, I'll scroll this down a bit. So yeah, because it's not added to yours, I'll take it out there and all that just for a sec. So you type in CPP BDN or BDN. CPP BDN 4001. And then press search. So that's the one. And then so we'll click on that. And then put in the enrolment key of construction with a capital C. Anybody else like a bit of assistance, or you?
I'm logged out.
What's that?
I'm logged out of it.
Oh, logged out of the computer.
Yeah, well, I've tried a couple of times and it's just like,
Yeah, right.
as in
Okay.
my password.
Yeah.
I've obviously done it a couple of times and it's
Yeah.
just like 3 years. That's why.
Try now.
I think yes, you spend a bit of time on computers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I did actually try an IT
Yeah.
degree once.
Yeah.
Dropped out.
Looking good. Looking good.
Okay.
That was the first thing about that school.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
just a while.
I just like email, I don't know if that's any different. But I only just use it, so
That's not too
I'll press the
Yeah, sure. What's that? Out back, possibly to the right, I think. Out back to the right. And you're all good? Fantastic.
nice. Yeah, computers are sort of a hobby thing for me.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. No, it's a necessary thing for me.
I build my own, so
Great.
saves me money.
Working. Fantastic.
Okay.
Alright. So just muck around with that for a minute, Carol. See if you can get onto the subject. If you can't, let me know. I'll sort that out. But yeah, we'll keep pushing on. So for everyone who's got in, this is what you will see on your screen. And when you get down, so the subject is split into 3 main sections. We've got residential dwelling, 2-story commercial, and 3-story commercial. There is some crossover between 2-story commercial and 3-story commercial, and we'll find that toward the end of the semester we get there's a little bit of repetition, and we're not so busy. However, at that point in time, you'll probably be flat out with the assignments, getting those last 2 done. If we click on residential dwelling, we'll see a bunch of subjects under residential dwelling, and that's what we'll be covering in the first few weeks. What I have grayed out at the moment, so what you're unable to see or open up on your computers today or through your Learn site today, is assignment 1 and program, let's say program semester 1. So what I need to do is I still need to update a few things on that. I'll be doing that after the class today, and if that's all great, I can get that done in time this evening. It'll be available for you guys tonight. But for now, we'll leave that alone. It's not until next week we start looking at assignment 1 anyhow, and it's not until about week 7 or 8 that it's due. So there's really no hurry with that one, but I should have that up and running tonight. Also, within the grid here on the Learn page, we've got one section before you start, In here, it shows you just a couple of essentials. One of them is application for extension and how to reference. Both of those are vital. I have been a little bit lax previously in regards to extensions and so on, but I find that it doesn't really help anybody in regards to that. So I do need to be quite firm in regards to extensions. If you are having significant issues, get that application to extension for me a week before the assignment's due, and because anytime after that, it's really too late to go sorting things out. So when all the information about assignment 1 is up and the due dates are up there, make yourself aware of those due dates and ensure that if there's something untoward happening, get that application to extension from you earlier. Look, terrible things do happen as well, and if something happens within that week, obviously let me know. We'll sort something out. But please take that one seriously. And also how to reference. So there's a guide here on how to reference. I'll add to this, and so this is something you can go through in your own time. Obviously, plagiarism is very important. It's taken very seriously, and it's actually really easy to assess plagiarism now, given that we can just grab bits of text, search for it, and find where they've been used before. And I've read many assignments, and so I'm very familiar with what's the students' work and what's not the students' work. Take that very seriously, but also in regards to the referencing or the sourcing of information, there is a great deal of fantastic information on the internet, and also some not so fantastic information on the internet. It's important that you build up those skills in learning how to differentiate between the two. But what we also have is on the internet, being a World Wide Web, we have information from South America, Northern America, Canada, Europe, where building approaches and building regulations are different. And what we need to be sure about is that we're referencing material and getting information which is local, so local to Australia. We have, in recent years, consolidated all the building regulation within Australia. So we used to have separate state codes. Now we have a national construction code. So it's all being pulled together, and you'll find that your most recent information on building all comes under that national construction code, and is it's relevant to us here in South Australia. But be aware of that, the timeliness of information, and whether it suits our national construction code. Within course information, you'll find information on the unit of competency. That's more, I guess, for my consideration in subject formulation, etc., to ensure that all the criteria, assessment criteria, are ticked off, and that we cover everything that's deemed accessible. However, if you want a bit of bedtime reading, having trouble getting to sleep, that's probably a good one to sink your teeth into. You're welcome to view it. And then following through, we have a section called Let's Get Started, and that's what we'll be working on today. So within the building process, an important consideration and something you cannot do without as a building designer these days are knowing about the various different consultants and authorities that you need to refer to in the building process. I mentioned earlier the National Construction Code, so we'll be referring to that quite a lot throughout this this subject. It governs pretty much the basic requirements or the minimum standards for any building operation within Australia, and it refers significantly to Australian standards. So within the building or the National Construction Code, there are two approaches that anybody designing a building can take. One of those approaches is the deemed to satisfy approach, which so the National Construction Code refers to the Australian standards, and if the portion of building work being specified complies with that Australian standard and complies with the information in the National Construction Code, that it is deemed to satisfy. So we can design in accordance with the Australian standards, and that's certainly the easiest fashion. The other approach that the National Construction Code enables is to have certification by a qualified engineer in that aspect of the National Construction Code to certify any other approach to building that aspect of the building. So that's where it gets a little bit more complex and a little bit more expensive, but where we can step outside just the standard approaches to building. So the National Construction Code gives those two approaches. Within the code, initially it breaks all building work up into various classes of building.
Is it the same as the BCA?
Yes, it is the same as the BCA, yeah. And like Learn and Moodle, you'll probably hear me refer to it as the BCA quite often as well, because it's always been the BCA for a very long time, and now that everything's been pulled under the one umbrella, it's called the National Construction Code. But because I've been working with the BCA for many years, like yourself, I'll probably refer to it as the BCA. But BCA, National Construction Code, same thing. So within the National Construction Code, it differentiates between the types of buildings. So all around us, if you were to look out the windows here at Tonsley, you'll see many different types of buildings. So here we have an institutional building. So for education, if we look up there, we go towards Flinders. We have another institutional building for education. We also have another institutional building for hospital and healthcare. We have heavy industrial just here with Monroe and whatnot. We used to have heavy industrial here with the manufacturing of Mitsubishi and Chrysler vehicles. Obviously, when this building was changed from a manufacturing facility to a TAFE, it had to undergo a different classification. So it starts off as just off the top of my head, I think maybe a Class 7, but don't quote me on that. Let's say it's a Class 7 building, and then it gets changed to actually a Class 8. There are upgrades that need to happen with the fire sprinkler system, with evacuation procedures, with air conditioning and other amenity for lighting, for ventilation, etc. So for toilet facilities. So there are all these upgrades and meeting various aspects of the National Construction Code that have to happen to enable the building to be used for different use. But also, when we go to design a building, it's important to understand the different classification of those buildings in the National Construction Code for understanding what is required in that building. And the National Construction Code differentiates between, say, high or intense residential or low density residential. Typically with the first subject, we're concerned with low density residential, so Class 1 and Class 1B buildings, or Class 1A and Class 1B buildings. So Class 1A is a single dwelling being a detached house or one or more attached dwellings, each being separated by a firewall, including a row house, terrace house, townhouse, villa or unit. Or Class 1B, a boarding house, guest house, hostel or light, total floor area not exceeding 300 square metres and in which not more than 12 persons would ordinarily reside, which is not located above or below another dwelling, etc. one of the reasons why we, class 1B includes boarding houses, but stops at 300 square metres and 12 occupants, is because they have to draw a line in the sand at one point. But in a boarding house, for example, when we start getting larger groups of people are less familiar with the building, and the people managing the building are less familiar with the occupants of the building. So in the case of a fire, when it's a small boarding house of maximum 1,200 people and only 300 square metres, that's a relatively manageable size for a single person to understand, okay, these people are home at the moment, they have to be evacuated, these people are away at the moment, etc. We have that sort of connectivity with the residents. Once we start getting larger than that, we need to have different procedures and facilities in place. And obviously with a class 1 or class 1A building a detached house or a residential apartment, the occupants are known to each other, and so our approach to fire safety and also amenity is different. Combined with that, we're interested in class 10 buildings, so non-habitable building or structure, so private garage, carport, shed, or the like. We teach these ones together because often they're built together. They're associated with each other. And then also class 10B, a structure being a fence over 2 metres, mast, antenna, retaining or freestanding wall, swimming pool, or the like. So around us, we have many different types of buildings, as mentioned before, with houses, flats, apartments, renovations, and extensions. Can anybody tell me what the difference between a flat and an apartment is?
I guess maybe one's like external stairs and others isn't it? No?
That might be part of it, although that's not a section I've ever had to explore. I'll explain there, but there's a good thought.
Is it a flat has its own individual access, whereas an apartment you go through a generalised access?
No.
More of a single room kind of unit where an apartment can have 3 bedrooms, several levels, 2 or 3 stories.
Although typically being the case, like flats are generally much smaller footprint. It's not the specific the real difference. The legal difference between a flat and an apartment. The legal difference is that flats, you've probably heard the term block of flats. So flats are separate residences that all come under the one certificate of title. So we cannot have separate ownership of a flat. So we can own a block of flats, or we can own an individual apartment or an individual unit. And it's an important consideration. And it was something that I was back in, I think about, I'm trying to think when it was, back in about 2002, 2003. There are a lot of, as a valuer, I was involved in assessing buildings for their conversion from flats to apartments for developers. And the major consideration in that conversion is whether we can have a fire separating wall between those separate occupancies. So if we scroll back up to here, one or more attached dwellings each being separated by a firewall. That means that there has to be a wall that extends right to the underside of the roofing that has structural integrity, insulation, and other aspect straight off the top of my head. But that needs to stand for 180 minutes, so for 3 hours. So it needs to be impervious to fire for that time. Because when we're dealing with multi-residential, if you have a fire in one unit, you want to stop that spread to other units that may or may not be aware of that fire happening. So to enable separate certificate of title to be issued for these flats to be then sold off separately, they had to meet that requirement of the National Construction Code. So having separate fire. The reason I thought what you added, having external or internal access differentiates too, that may also come under the National Construction Code as well as a criteria for being able to attribute a separate certificate of title. But that I'm not entirely sure about.
So
But
can
it's
Strata
about-
have both?
What's that?
Can Strata be both?
Yes.
So it's a single certificate of title, but you might have 6 different parties.
Yeah. Strata is a funny melding of the two. So when we have high density residential development, up until it was the early 90s or mid 90s. So up until about the mid 90s, when a developer would build a high density residential development, they would use strata title for that, which attributes a separate certificate of title for each dwelling, and so they would all have to have fire separating walls, and all this sort of happened from 1970 something onwards. So it's only the really early blocks of flats that didn't. But the later ones had their separate fire compartmentalisation, etc., and they were given separate certificates of title. But at that point in time, what we use now, which is called community title, had not been developed or invented as a legal concept. So we use strata title, and strata title is where everybody has a part interest in everybody else's dwelling. And then that part interest is managed by a separate group or entity called Strata Corp. They impose fees upon each of the people that own a strata unit, and then use those fees for maintenance and upkeep of the building. It's a little bit of a messy ownership structure, and that's why we sort of moved on from that, and we've enabled community title now. I might be able to touch on that a little bit later on. But the term strata, that comes from the ability to own not only so typically we own in a geographic sense, so we have geographic boundaries of our allotment. Like this property here has a geographic boundary. What a strata unit has is a boundary in strata, so a vertical boundary. So this distance off the ground your title starts and finishes at that distance off the ground, for example. So, that's a form of title which is still really prevalent because it was used for such a long time. But any new developments, are typically going with community title now.
So going back to the firewall thing, does that mean flats don't have firewalls?
Yes. So buildings that have stayed as flats, it's probably because the firewall was too difficult or too expensive to impose. There may have been other aspects of the National Construction Code that were too difficult to attain, but typically the big hurdle was always about creating that fire separation. And there was a real flurry on that in the early 2000s, people buying these blocks of flats and doing them. So if there's any blocks of flats out there that haven't been done, it's probably because they can't be. So it's do your homework there. It was just an example of the importance in understanding these differentiations in the National Construction Code. And then under our residential, of course, we also look at renovations and extensions, etc. As building designers and drafters, this is probably a large volume of your work. So commercial, we have shops, offices, restaurants and cafes, etc. And then industrial, factories and warehouses. So here's a diagrammatic representation of the National Construction Code and the different classes of buildings. So class 1, that's our houses and our townhouses. Class 2 are our flats. Class 3 are our boarding houses. Class 5 and 6 are our offices and shops and residential healthcare and detention centres.
So 4 to 6.
Yep, and 4 is an interesting one. So that is a flat in class 5, in a class 5, 6, 7, 8 or 9 building. And they are, they are actually relatively common. You don't normally see them from the street, but many of the buildings in the city, when they were built in the 1920s, 1930s, etc., they had caretakers living on site and maintenance people that lived on site. And so on top of many of the major buildings around the city, you'll also have a little tiny house perched on the top, or flat, or cream bricker perched on the top. And people live in these today still. And so they're a class 4 building, and they're treated as a separate class to your standard residential. Class 7, car parks and warehouses. Class 8, factories, which is what this would have been initially. And then class 9, healthcare, hospitals, assembly, schools, aged care, nursing homes, etc., which this building now is. And then class 10, garages, sheds, etc. So buildings must comply with planning regulations. So over the entirety of our state, anywhere in the state, you come under one council area or another. And within those council areas, the Development Act gives power to those councils to apply their development plan. Has anybody used an online resource called SA Map Viewer before? No one's familiar with that? It's fairly new. It's been out and functional for about a year now. Has anybody been on to planningsa.gov before? You have? Yeah.
With the development prospect.
Yeah. Yeah. So planningsa.gov, it's still up and running, and it's still really useful for getting all of the detailed information about council wide planning. But also, in conjunction with SA Map Viewer, has brought all of this information together within a mapping program. So, in fact, I'll see if I can bring it up right now. Yeah, another one. Another page happening here. So SA Map Viewer for location SA. It's out there. Yeah. Oh, it hasn't come up yet. Let's just show roads. Get a little less busy. Data sets. Let's go for land management, property and planning. Let's bring up some bushfire protection areas, for example. So we can bring up this. This is actually this is cadastral. No, it's not. Oh yes, it is. Yeah. So a cadastral map shows the boundaries of allotments, and a topocadastral map shows all the contours of the land with all the cadastral information on it, so the boundaries of various different allotments. Now, zoomed in here, we're in Fullerton, I guess. We don't have any bushfire regulations within Fullerton, so that's not showing us anything. So what I've chosen from our data set is bushfire regulation, but all this area does. So that's all covered. Under our data sets, I could also add. Let's have a look. Design wind speed. That's a good one. Let's go with that. So it shows us our design wind speed. We'll probably cover that later on. But that basically it's been worked out for the metropolitan area what type of wind loadings we need to design houses to resist. And this map shows you what type of wind loading you need to resist. So we've got N3 all along the coast here, N2 further back a little bit, or N3 also around the airport, because it's just a big flat corridor without much built up infrastructure straight off the sea. So we have that N2 surrounding that, and then N1 for the bulk of our residential area, except for a few pockets, etc. And then all of these areas around here and further out, that's individual assessment. So you've got to determine that for yourself. But that's something we'll cover at a later date. But this SA Map Viewer brings together all of this information. So previously you'd have to get this information from council websites and from Planning SA and from various different sources and pull it together yourself. The state government's done all that now. SA Heritage Places, let's chuck that on there as well and scoot into the Adelaide City. And there we go, we've got places marked there of state heritage in red and what are the blue ones? So they'd be local heritage, so they'd be Adelaide City Council listed, whereas the red ones are state heritage listed. So we have all that. Valuation cadastre, that enables you to determine what, or the legal definition of, how would I explain it? Every property, or every separate title within the state has a valuation, the Valuer General's reference. So the Valuer General, that's a department, but it's just now been privatised, but previously it was a government department that did valuations for rating and taxing on all parcels of land, so that when you go to pay your council rates, that is assessed on what the Valuer General has attributed to your land. It's not necessarily a market value, it sort of hovers around somewhere just a little bit below market value to be general. It's not a market valuation, but it's a valuation to make it equitable between all the properties. So typically properties that are worth more have a higher capital value, which is the Valuer General's figure. And they have assessment numbers. So that's what should be happening up there. The assessment numbers I thought are a 10-digit number, we're only giving a 6-digit number there. So maybe that's something to explore later. Parcel cadastre. Actually, I might turn some of this wind speed off. It's getting a bit too busy there. Parcel cadastre. So that shows us lot 3 for that one, for example. I won't muck around with it too much. If I was to cruise through here, looking through here, we can pull up the zoning of properties. So what the zoning is, whether it's residential 1, residential 2, whether it's commercial and various different types of commercial or light industrial, etc. Land development. Oh, there we go. Land development plan zone categories. For that. And when we choose that, because it's starting to get a bit too busy, it's not showing everything on the allotments, we can then do a left click on that, and then it brings us that information that we've asked for. So So Development Plan Adelaide Zone CC, which is Capital City Zone, Policy Area 13. So within the city, because it gets very busy with all their zoning, they have various different categories under their zoning. So we've got Capital City Zone, and then we're up to Policy Area 13. So that Capital City area will be divided up into all these little areas, and that's Central Business Policy Area. Oh yeah, because we're right next to Kingdom Street here, right by the law courts. That's why they're heritage listed. Yeah. So fantastic tool. Yeah, sink your teeth into it. If you need, I'm sure you'll find that very helpful throughout your working career, or for any of this type of work you're doing at home. So, as I was saying, the whole state is divided up into various different council areas, and they impose their development plan upon those bits of land. Now, those development plans are split into two main areas. One are the council-wide objectives. So, let's say for Adelaide Hills Council, they will say, we want an area that is characterised by small townships and low impact or low density agricultural activity that has minimal impact upon water resources, and the limitation of light industrial to be, how do I say it, not harmonious, but contributory to agricultural and local production. That will be their council-wide objective. So they paint a picture of this is what we want to have, and then they will have separate zones for various different areas. So they will have like a hills face zone. That's a notorious zone where that incorporates everything that we can see from down here on the flat, looking up the hills. That's hills face, and that has to be treated separately, because what the Adelaide City Council wants and what the councils down here don't want are buildings that stand out on that hills face. We want to protect that sense of the hills being a natural area covered by vegetation, etc. From here, have that nice view, and so we have a separate zone for that. Then further back from that, which is they'll have predominantly water protection zone or water protection primary industry, so WPP zone, and that's where, and then they'll have many different policy areas within that, but that's all intended to ensure that there are not things like extractive industries happening, that there's not intense livestock production that will have impacts on the water, on the runoff, etc. That there's not that intense agricultural industry that has negative impacts, because as you probably know, we've got creeks 1 through to 6, the first creek, second creek, etc. through to 6th creek, that all come out. Their genesis is in the hills. There, water's caught up in the hills and then flows down through those creeks and makes its way out through the Adelaide plain here. So what we want to minimise is the amount of nutrients and so on going into those water. So council will have zones for that, and they'll have zones for country townships. So for local, they'll have country township Lobethal, for example, and they'll say a maximum of 3 stories or so, and it will have to have this sort of setback, this amount of private space, etc. And so they have their council-wide objectives, and then they have the zoning that is specific to certain little areas and pockets or properties that are similar in some fashion, and that happens statewide. So each council has its overall objectives and then its specific zoning requirements. So what I pulled up there before with that property just off King William Street that had the CC zoning, that is the CC is the specific zoning for that property, and we can get all that information from Planning SA, what the exact requirements of that zoning are. But if we were to propose a development on that piece of land, we would have to look at those specific zoning requirements, and we'd also have to look at the overall council objectives. So what what typifies the Adelaide city centre. So the local council has a say on what you can do. That's typically government requirements, and also for any major projects that may have to be referred to the state government for assessment, and then for building an airport or something like that, well then it goes to federal government assessment. By and large, you're going to be dealing with local government, with the local councils. There are encumbrances on properties. Now, the best way to think about, or to remember what an encumbrance is that it's anything that encumbers the use of a property. So you, let's say you own this parcel of land. There are things lodged on the title that can tell you what you can and can't do with that piece of land, and I guess essentially under that zoning is an encumbrance because it encumbers the use of your land and stops you from doing certain things. But other typical encumbrances, well, can anybody think of some typical encumbrances?
Yeah, your septic pipe, common septic pipes that might run through a street.
Yeah, and what do we have lodged on the title to delineate that pipe?
It'll actually be drawn. There's a boundary actually on the title.
Yeah.
Where it labels the encumbrance.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's hashed out. You can't build on this spot. You can't put cement or a shed or anything. This has to be kept clean in case it comes to dig it up.
Yeah. So that's typically an easement used.
Yeah, I was going to say usually there's an easement there.
Yes. Yep. So usually there is an easement. So pretty much always for sewer and for stormwater, for where you have common stormwater running through typically the backs of properties that are on the low side of the road, you have easements there that delineate that. And
Gas pipes as well, then?
yes, gas pipes as well. You have easements for gas pipes. You have easements for electricity as well, and
Optic fibre to Australia.
yeah,
Big, huge water mains.
yeah.
We've got all four of them in our bus.
Right, okay. Yeah, yours would probably be an interesting title to look at for class discussion then.
You often have easements for access to real properties and things like that too.
You do have it, yes, yeah. And typically in a lot of the the early divided areas, like so around Parkside, Unley, Port Adelaide, these inner the places where houses were built late 1800s or so, you've got shared driveways, you've got easements for access through people's properties. And up where I live, it's really common as well. Like, we live in a gully, and then you've got to drive through people's places to get there. You've got to have an easement for access over everybody else's land.
Fire tracks as well. Like your property might actually be in the middle of a fire track, so you have to keep that area clear. Up around Strath, it's big with us.
Yes, yeah. Typically, they're not covered by easements, though, are they? The fire tracks.
It's on your title, and sometimes you don't know it's there until they want to use it, and then all of a sudden you find your title then has it put on there.
Right. That's something I'm not very familiar with. I might get a bit more familiar with that.
Just another encumbrance is height.
Height? Yes.
Because
Yeah.
particularly like down at Victor Harbour, people trying to protect their views. So yeah,
Yes.
Curious.
Yeah. And also in the city. And that's an interesting one, the way that the Adelaide City Council deal with that. They have agreed upon heights of buildings, but you can actually trade building height. So you can go, all right, well, I'm going to buy some building height off that person there that only wants to build to 7 stories because I want to do 13, and I want that extra 3 stories that the council won't allow me to do.
So I thought everyone would have tried to build as high as they wanted to.
Well, essentially they do.
Isn't that a big thing these
But-
days? Try and put the biggest skyscraper you can.
Yeah, but it's also about highest and best use of land as well. And as you'd know, if you're up on the hills and you look out over the Adelaide city centre, it sort of goes like this a bit. And as you get closer in to that King William Street sort of Rundle Mall nexus, the buildings get, actually we're right at that point, they're a bit low. But in that central area they get taller because I guess you get there's density of use, and people want to be right in the centre of the city for that exposure. They want to have their name on the front of the building, etc. They want to have that King William Street address. And so if you own a block of land on King William Street and you're going to be developing a building, that extra floor is worth more to you than it is for someone right down the end of Piney Street near West Terrace there. But if they've been allotted a certain height and you've been allotted a certain height, and I'm not exactly sure how it all happens, but there is the ability, or there has been in the past, of some trading.
Prospect did that with us. So
Mhm.
you've got Churchill Road on one side of our property, because we were a place at Fitzroy Avenue.
Yeah.
And so they rezoned us. We were built in '86. We're a strata of 6 years.
Yeah.
We were rezoned heritage, so that no one could build any further in height. And so now developers on Churchill Road and Prospect Road can now build a lot higher, because they've pretty much not bought our height. We're allowed 2 stories, but we can't now do 2-story because that's already been given to these corridors on Prospect Road, Churchill Road, Main North Road. So that's how the council will do it. They'll actually rezone your area, what they did to us,
Right.
so that also stops a developer knocking down our next door neighbour and putting a 10-story building in. So it also does that as well.
Yeah.
But
So
that's
there's some
sort of
benefits
bought
to it,
out
and
by-
there's some drawbacks.
Because the property across the road's development for 3-story house had run out. They now
Mhm.
can't do it because they're now not allowed to go more than 1 story
Oh dear.
because of the rezoning
Yeah,
which happened in
yeah.
November
Yeah.
2 years ago.
Yeah, and that's kind of the way with any government decision. There are winners and losers, but particularly in planning and zoning, certainly there's the big winners and big losers in that. And while we're on that topic, also an issue you have with zoning is, so let's say I own a farm right on the edge of Craigmore or Blakeville or something like that. And at the moment it's zoned for primary production. I can just run a few sheep on it, and then all of a sudden the council rezones that as residential. That means that I can carve that up into however many blocks, put some roads in there and things like that, and sell them all off. The difficulty though is if I wanted to stay a farmer and just keep running sheep on that block, all of a sudden the rezoning means the value of that land has gone from $300,000 to, let's say, $4 to $5 million. I then have to pay rates and taxes on a property value of $4 to $5 million. Those rates and taxes are simply unaffordable for me at running a few sheep. And so basically, when the council rezones in these fashions, it's a guarantee that will just be subdivided and built up as well. I think we're digressing a little bit, but yes, encumbrances. So there are all those encumbrances for easements, and they are by and large the largest encumbrance you'll come across. There are easements for power access, and it's important to mention that there are 2 different types of easements for power as well. One is obvious, which is your standard easement, which is lodged upon a title. They show that there. The other is what's called a statutory easement. So it does get a little bit confusing. To put it simply, like to cover most of the cases, all of the larger voltage power lines, I think it's 415 volts and up, they have a statutory easement underneath them. So although you may not have an easement lodged on your title, if you've got high voltage power lines running across, SA Power Networks has a statutory easement on your property, and that limits what you can build. But also, typically on those statutory easements, you are actually allowed to encroach upon that easement with a building as well. That has to be done in consultation with SA Power Networks, but they do have some guidelines there that are available on their website as well about how you can build under high voltage power lines. If you so wished. Yeah. So typically power supply has those 2 types of easements to be aware of.
Phase 1 and phase 3?
Yeah, so three-phase power is 415 volts. Yeah, and then your standard residential phase one is 240 volts, and typically your what's called a consumer mains. That's going to be just your 240 volts. Some properties have consumer mains of 415, but it's
That was also stopped when the farm was getting all this land care money. We had the power lines running through our place.
yeah.
So we weren't allowed to have any trees within so distance of power lines.
Right.
And we were restricted on what species of tree we have too. So you weren't allowed to have a lemon scented gum within 60 metres of the power line.
Right.
So there's a heap of other guidelines and rules that those power lines have to work.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can, I can understand that. 60 metres is a huge buffer, but yes, you can understand that as well.
I was going to ask before about whether like tree roots and like as you said with different types of trees and stuff, obviously some of them are pre-rooted into like, pipes and stuff like that and just like block up drains and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Like, not much is an issue for like power and stuff like that, or in general like say it's like a heritage gum tree and like you can't really just screw it up or
Yeah.
whatever and build like right next to it. Is that much of an issue very often?
Well, for as far as and there's probably plenty of stuff I don't know, but in regards to easements, I don't know that there's typically any issue with you planting whatever tree you want. Obviously, that is an exception.
With the septic, if your one busts through the common effluent, what can happen is the council or the association will charge you for the maintenance of that repair of that pipe.
Right.
So if your tree root punches a hole through a common effluent, you planted that tree, and they can prove that you planted that tree,
Yeah.
then you can be asked to fit the bill.
Right. Yeah.
That's how it would sort
Okay.
of, not for me.
Yeah. Yeah. There you go. Yeah. I was unaware of that. Yeah. That certainly makes sense. But yeah, it's a very, very tricky area there, isn't it? To know what species of tree will do that, what species won't, and then also that determination of, okay, well, if the tree roots found it, was it leaking initially? Was there some initial leak that attracted the tree roots to it? It gets very, very messy. But further, although it's not about trees, but further to that, in regards to some easements for electricity and some easements for common effluent and for sewer and so on, you are restricted to what concrete you can put over the top as well. So you're actually allowed to put concrete pavers up to a certain dimension over top of these things as well. I think it's like 600 by 600 or the larger pavers you can use over those easements. It's basically just to enable access. And there are many easements for all sorts of reasons. I think we've covered most of them though, but other encumbrances include developers' encumbrances. That's a massive one. So I'm back on that sheep farm up near Craigmore again, and I've done a development on my land. I've carved it all up. Typically what happens with the bulk of developments on greenfield sites like that is the developer will say you can only build houses with brick veneer or rendered finishes. You must have ColourBond, and sometimes ColourBond of this particular range, or tile roofing. You must have established gardens within 12 months.
Even roof pitches, they can be specific.
Yes, yeah. So specific about all these visual aspects of the building, and the reason that developers impose those developers' encumbrances on those blocks is because there are people that do enjoy homogeneity of a residential area. They will go, oh look, I'm wanting to build in Blackwood Park because I know that I'm not going to get a mud brick house with a straw roof next to me, or so they know that they will get buildings of a certain type and a certain character, and then the developer can say, look, yes, we're doing this development, it's going to look like this. Or even like in Mawson Lakes, there was even several choices of paving you could do, etc. So there are all these things that dictate the aesthetics. And so that is a major constraint for building designers within these residential developments. Typically, outside of those large greenfield development sites, you don't have builders' encumbrances. So you have far more flexibility with your design and what you can do, what style you can inject on the property. Other encumbrances could be caveats, and that's a handy one for builders to know. That let's say I'm a builder, I've done some work for somebody, they've decided not to pay me. What I can do, like I can't just do it willy-nilly, I have to go through the courts to do so, but I can put a caveat on that title. I can lodge a caveat on that title that stops that person from being able to sell that particular piece of property. So until they've paid me what they are contracted to pay me, they're unable to realise the value of that property. So caveats are lodged for those reasons. Caveats are lodged from family disputes and matrimonial disputes, etc. And you have to be aware of those as well. Basically, your conveyancer has to be aware of those, and your conveyancer is a person who covers the legal transaction of a title from one person to another when you purchase it. But also, as a building designer, it might be it's well worth your while searching the title anyhow, because you get the diagram of the property, and it'll tell you who owns the property. You don't want to be doing design work for somebody who doesn't actually even own the property. But then it will also tell you whether there are any caveats lodged on that property. And if you have a caveat lodged by a builder, on that property, and it's still currently lodged on that builder, you wouldn't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole as a building designer, because you probably want to get paid as well. So it's important to understand about those caveats. And then, there's another term, liens, which actually I don't know too much about liens, but they're an interest by somebody else on that piece of land. There are leases lodged on titles. So for your standard residential lease, that's not lodged on a title, but for a pastoral lease, it would be. So a lot of your really big stations further north, they have 99-year leases, or whatever the extent that lease is, and they have various certificates of title, and that lease is lodged on that title. Or for a lot of your river shacks, actually a lot of them being sold privately now, but up till 10 years ago, a lot of shacks, etc., were leasehold, and that's also an important thing to understand as for purchases, that with a lot of the shacks, let's say along the River Murray. Yep, sure.
Sorry, guys.
That's right.
Can you get in?
Yeah, no, it's both sides.
Sorry.
Thanks. Excuse that. Sorry. Yeah, so liens and leases, etc. And what happened along the River Murray and a lot along our coastline is that properties were previously, like all these shacks were leasehold shacks. So for all intents and purposes, they were given 99-year leases, and people built pretty simple places there because they weren't, they didn't actually own the land. And when that 99 years ticks over, they may own it or they may not. Then it was around 2000 through to 2005, the state government started, I forget the name of the process, what they called it, but basically selling off or freeholding all of those allotments. So a requirement of that freeholding was that all of the shacks had to get together and do a common effluent scheme. So they had to pump into a septic tank up on a hill or so, and that's all dispersed and done properly. So they had to pay for that, sort of $10,000-$15,000 per shack to join that scheme. But then they had the possibility to freehold. So and at that time they could buy that piece of land from the state government really cheap, like around the $20,000 mark or so. People freehold it, and then all of a sudden they could borrow against what they own, and the value of shacks just shot through the roof. But there are still some shacks that have not been freeholded, and beware of those. So there was some shacks, and they're still there at Murray Bridge, but they've only got like a year or two left on their leasehold, and the council say that they're not going to renew those leases. And a colleague of mine, as a valuer, was charged with doing the valuation of one of those shacks, and he said, well, it's worth basically, it's worth like $20,000 or something. I think he put the figure on it, because in a couple of years' time, that shack has to be demolished, and the people have to pay for the removal and reinstatement of that site as it was, which cost around the $15,000 mark to do. And so understanding the legal interest in the land is incredibly important. Not so much in that case for building designers, but for any building developers or owners or purchasers of that. But that's another encumbrance or another interest in property. We've covered zoning requirements, and then we have heritage considerations. So heritage considerations can be things like state heritage listing, which is the most significant of the heritage listings, and then you have local government heritage listings as well. State heritage listings can be incredibly restrictive with what you do on a property, and you're smiling about that one. But yeah, it can be like we had to reinstate a concrete slab on a veranda for a state heritage listed property. Had to do that without mesh, without any control joints, with the intention that the new concrete will crack in a traditional fashion. So it's things like that. Or a place up at Palmdorf was made out of red gum slabs, and that burnt partially, and it was really very interesting. It had hand sawn timbers and everything in the roof, but we had to retain all of that and then build a new structure to hold the dwelling sort of within that. So in years to come, people may look at that and think, what on earth were they thinking? Why did they go to all this when they could have just put in some plywood gussets or whatever on these bits of timber and say the building that way? You're not actually allowed, and that can have big ramifications on the activities of a building designer and what you can do. So you can be aware of those. But with that, like that SA map viewer that I showed you, we can get quick reference as to, okay, are we dealing with a state heritage listed or a local government listed building? building regulations, as mentioned before, compliance with the National Construction Code, incorporating BCA. So, and we'll look at that in detail further on in weeks to come. It's a very, very foggy scan of a certificate of title. So, but that's what your certificate of title looks like. Certificates of title in the past were of significant value simply because there was a title that was kept at the Lands Titles Office and a title that you kept at home. When I started studying a long time ago, you can only bring a pencil into the Lands Titles Office. You're not allowed to bring a pen into the Lands Titles Office to go up and look at the titles, because if somebody brought a pen in there, they can make amendments to a title or destroy that title. They're all held electronically now. So now the value of a title is $22. That's what it costs you to do a printout. You can do the printout online, or you can go into the Lands Titles Office and do that. And so all that information is kept electronically now, and the only people that can make amendments to that are the Lands Titles Office. So if your copy of your title gets destroyed in a fire at home or something like that, well, another $22 will get you another one. In that, so it shows registered proprietor in fee simple. So it shows who owns the property. Gives the description of land, so that's a legal description. So that's lot 12 in community plan 248-55 in the area Mount Barker, I think, etc. And so, as I mentioned, community plan before, that's something which is superseded strata plan. So community plan enables the separate ownership of a defined parcel within a larger parcel of land. So we've got a certificate of title which covers a large area, but the council allows us to build 12 buildings on that, and we divide that up using a community plan. So that shows the difference in everybody's community allotment within that plan. It doesn't have any easements, so the easements recorded on the property. Schedule of endorsements. So encumbrance to, so many Maria nominees or so, you'd have to explore the nature of that encumbrance. And there's an agreement under the Development Act, so that may be a development approval on the property already, and then it's got a mortgage to, let's say, Capital Proprietary Limited or something like that, and then any documents affecting this title. So there are other various different plans that have been filed that will affect that, and they may be easements that are neighbouring the property, or a development adjacent to the property or so. So that's what's contained on the front page of the title. Yeah, unfortunately I don't have a back page of the title there. I think I've got a back page of the title. It's in my satchel actually. I'll pass it around. Pass these around, please ensure they come back. So, actually no, I won't pass the front page around, excuse that, but it's basically the same information as all that. But our second page of the title has our, a survey plan image on that, which shows the boundaries of the property and any easements, etc. I'll just check. Yeah, none of that's of any interest to anyone. So that's typically what a survey plan image looks like. That's a particularly clean one. So no easements and so on shown on that. So as I mentioned before, the Development Act is an act. I think it's I'm not sure if it's federal government or state government, but it was an act passed in 1994 that says that council can apply zoning to your property. So it covers heritage issues, social issues, so in regards to how we want to shape society by our urban planning, basically. What sort of connection and facilities we want to apply. Economic issues, so how does the urban development affect the economy, and how can we best manage that? So so we can maximise the utility of the city. And then the very important one is environmental. So planning, so zoning basically took off as an idea to manage, like initially back in the 1960s, to manage environmental impacts with areas like Bowden and Brompton, where there was lots of light industry happening, but then also lots of people living as well, and people getting lead poisoning and sickness from various different things. And so the intention is to separate particularly things like residences and industrial.
So country towns can't have that issue.
So country towns do have that issue.
So for instance, probably a place like Albury.
Yes, yeah. Well, yes, yeah, and some things and a lot. I guess. Oh, look, you could probably argue this to the cows come home, but for all intents and purposes, things like lead smelter in Port Pirie, that was, I assume, it was put in there before the actual full effects of lead were known and before that was fully understood. And they think, okay, well, we can put that lead smelter here, and it's right next to all these houses. That's great because there's plenty of people that live there that can work here, and that's all really good. But as we learn more about the detrimental effects of these things, we decide, okay, no, we need to separate those things. But when you have an existing use, when you have a financial interest in a property, particularly a big thing like a lead smelter or something, that's very hard to move or to change.
They repurpose it, I think. Now
it's repurposed.
Yeah, they just get rid of or break down other metals now from just junk.
Yeah. So and
take things like gold and stuff out of all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And although I really don't know much about.
Oh, I don't know. I just know I've got family out there. But
Yeah. But without knowing much about Port Pirie, generally the way these things sort of pan out is when an industry becomes no longer viable, like let's say the power station up at Port Augusta, it was too expensive to keep running, it becomes no longer viable, all of a sudden that's when council has the opportunity to move something like that out of the city because, well, there was always out of the city, but it closes down as a power station, and then the local council will say, well, look, we can't use this as a power station anymore, we can't use this as a lead smelter anymore, it has to be this particular thing. And that's, I imagine that's sort of the mechanism that was happening with the redevelopment of this building here as an educational institution as opposed to a heavy industrial site. And I guess many of you know, well, it's not so much this site right here, but it's a site neighbouring where they were using ethylene something or other for polishing mag wheels, and that's in the water and it's affecting various. So we have all those issues, and that's why we have that. Why we have zoning imposed. So we have these zonings of residential, industrial, semi-industrial, and rural. Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. So a little bit more about the National Construction Code goals, or goals of BCA. So this is where we're going to be using National Construction Code and BCA interchangeably to ensure structural sufficiency. So places have to be built in a way that obviously they've got to stand up, and they've got to stand up to various different effects, whether those effects be cyclones or seismic activity or fire or soil movement. Yeah, exactly. So, soil movement's a big one in South Australia, cyclones and seismic activity not. They have to be able to handle the effects of fire, but also ensure that people are kept as safe as possible in the advent of fire. Health and amenity, so that covers things like access to fresh air and natural light. We don't want too many buildings like the old Royal Adelaide Hospital now, the small windows, no natural light, very poor ventilation, etc. Access and egress. So stairs, for example, they can't be this sort of that steep, and they can't be that steep. We have, cheers, thanks. We have boundaries or design boundaries imposed by the National Construction Code that tells us how we can access a building, what way is safe, and also it covers access and egress for people with disabilities, for mobility issues. So there's all this design around that. And energy efficiency. So that's a part of the National Construction Code to ensure that the buildings we're building don't have really big requirements for heating and cooling. So our design can take away a lot of that load. And it's really, well, I'm going to say it was simple. The concepts of building solar passive houses, it is relatively simple, and with a bit of mucking around it, these sort of aspects can easily be incorporated into building design to make a comfortable building that doesn't need too many inputs. And so the National Construction Code covers that to a degree. There are limitations imposed by it. So BSAN Volume 2 covers Class 1 and 10 buildings. That's what we're covering within the residential aspect of this subject. So the NCC reference Australian standards. So there are Australian standards about just about everything. Like you probably see a piece of wire in that conduit there. It's probably got AS, NZS. Yeah, what's that?
3,000.
Oh, 3,000. Of course, Yeah. So yeah, you've got Australian standards printed on everything. There's probably Australian standards printed on a bit of that. Oh no, that's old. That's pretty old steel. But now, if you buy a piece of equal angle, you've got Australian standard written on there. Australian standards cover basically every aspect of building, be it how the materials are manufactured and perform, or how those materials are inserted into the building. How I fix something. How I fix that cable tray to the wall, for example. It's all covered by Australian standards, and so the National Construction Code, if you were to read through it, it is a lot of referencing Australian standards. So it's as per Australian standard 3950 something pushed by. So various categories of standards are dimensional standards. How to test various different sizes and what sizes things need to be. Test methods. So if there's an Australian standard for concrete and concrete structures, tells us how we should go testing the compressive strength of a core of concrete. What size that core of concrete needs to be and how long that piece needs to cure before we test it. Terms and symbols. So that's an important one for drafters. So there's an Australian standard for technical drawing, and that sets out how we draw things. And a funny one with that is a lot of the standards you'll see they have AS NZS before the number. That AS NZS means Australian standard and New Zealand standard. So we've gotten together with New Zealand to apply the same standards on many things, and technical drawing is one of those. And that was a really interesting thing in that typically if I draw a door in elevation, so I'm looking at that door. This is our door here like this, and that's our floor. We do that as a nice thick line, 0.7 or so. With my door, I want the door handle to be on that side like that. I don't always draw the door handle in a drawing, but the way somebody can automatically look at this and go, this is where the door handle is, that's where the hinges are, is on every door you put in a line like that. That line goes from hinge to handle to hinge. And a while back, and it's created a bit of confusion, I'm pretty sure it was the Australian way of doing it, where in Australia we were drawing it as handle to hinge. Handle. Like exactly the opposite way. And I'm glad we went with hinge to handle to hinge, because that just makes sense. But that's why we need standards like that, because typically that is the only reference that a builder gets as to which way a door will swing. So it's shown on elevation and then it's shown on plan like this, as your door swing, and then you got your opening there, like that, and that's your walls, several different lines, etc. But let's say, let's say it was drawn wrong. Builder sees that on the plans and that on the elevations, and they go, I don't know what I'm meant to do. So they phone up their site supervisor. Site supervisor goes, well, I don't know. Phone up the architect. The architect goes, I didn't draw it. The architect gets in contact with the drafter. The drafter gets back, oh, sorry, yes, I made a mistake, blah, 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 blah. In that time, a week has passed. We can't, and that's best case scenario. Worst case scenario is builder goes, plans take precedence over elevations, hence I'm going to chuck it in that way. So that's why we have standards for terms and symbols. But you'll notice when you get into residential drafting, there's a whole bunch of terms and symbols, and you'll understand why it is so handy to have common agreements on what they should be and how they should be expressed. Codes of practice. I can't think of any particular Australian standards to relate to codes of practice in building. It's not something we encounter.
That would be something like in concrete and stuff like that. They would have to make the concrete to conform to the code of practice of the wouldn't they? Because there's different types of concrete.
Yes, you do have. Yeah, maybe that is. Maybe that is what code of practice covers. I may have to look into that bit, but that's or maybe code of practice does refer to construction method, etc. as well. And within building, so.
And it would also
many
probably
construction methods.
include like WHS and things like that.
Yes, that is definitely code of practice. Yeah, workplace health and safety. Which there is a separate act for. So Australian standards in relation to contracts, etc. Typically, with our dealings with contracts, as building designers, we're dealing with residential contracts. They are, and you get pro forma contracts from the Master Builders Association or the Housing Industry Association. You can buy them. They're a standard residential contract, and typically we don't differ from those significantly. But there are Australian standards on how contracts should be drawn for certain circumstances. And for some reason it's tacked on here, the Timber Framing Code, Australian Standard 1684. So that's an Australian standard which you will get to know very well, or we should get to know it very well. I think there's less and less impetus to be teaching that thoroughly now, because there are just a whole bunch of programs that have taken over from initially, and you would have done this when you're sizing up pieces of timber. You do it per the timber span tables. So you go, all right, I've got this roof load width impacting on this. I'll that column there, blah blah blah. I need a lintel of 190/35 or something like that. And whereas now there are various different programs put out by the timber manufacturers like Design IT, by Carter Holt Harvey. You just download it for free, got it on your computer, and you go, oh yes, I've got a roof load width of this, type that in, that, Well,
that'd be more along the laminated beam side of thing though, wouldn't it?
typically that's what I've used it for, but you can specify MGP 10. There's a pull down thing, and you go, all right, I want to specify these things in MGP 10. I can specify it in MGP 12 or F5 or
That's handy.
F17 or whatever. Yeah, it is handy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there are more and more of these programs being written all the time, and although it's not really happening yet, I see it's probably not in the too distant future where we have drawing programs with all these plugins for truss design and for masonry design, all these things, so that we start drawing up a place and we specify the wind speed, and then it tells us what size
That is cool.
timber members will need throughout the whole. I don't see that as being too difficult to do now that so many of these little things have been designed, that it's all about creating those plugins. So, but be that as it may, it is still important to understand things like the timber framing code, where all those sizes come from, what all that comes from, because as you know with programs, particularly drawing programs, they don't allow you to do everything. And it's the people who can do the stuff that's outside the box that are the people that are employable. It is a great one still to get your head around and know the limitations of. So under the Development Act, building works requiring approval are things like new construction, demolition or removal of a building, excavation or filling incidental to construction or demolition, structural alterations, or any other prescribed activity, just to broaden and just catch everything in the net. So the Development Act says, yes, you have to apply for council approval for all these things, but then there might be some things they haven't thought of, so they just add that on there as well.
Can't you build a shed 3x5 under 15 square metres without council approval?
That is all council specific. So that and it's getting harder and harder to do those things now because of public liability insurance. And so it was until fairly recent, a few years, let's say 10 years ago, there wasn't a great deal of requirement for public liability insurance. So if you're building a new house, yes, you have to show council that you're covered by public liability insurance. And then they started extending that to retaining walls, naturally, but then started extending that to smaller and smaller works to so anything to the value of about $12,000. Now, a lot of councils have brought that forward to, things like values of $1,000 or $2,000. So, yeah. And so your 15 square metre shed or so, yeah.
The shed costs as much to get approval for it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so those requirements are becoming more and more, but still there are council areas that anything under $12,000 you don't need public liability insurance for, and you don't need to have a builder's license for, and so on. So they still exist, but it's council specific. And that it's changing. So procedure for development approval. You lodge an application with council. That approval consists of planning consent and building rules consent. So your planning consent, that is assessed against the development plan. So the council, they have their council-wide objectives and their specific zoning for the property. And typically with a planning consent, you have to show site plan, elevations, floor plan, and then sometimes any other plans that dictate how your building will affect the neighbouring area. So sometimes you have to put in a shadowing plan. Sometimes council will want a section, but not always. For these various things.
Sometimes they also, if you've got something that's a little unusual, they'll go to the neighbours and allow the neighbours an opportunity to put their back, to basically say no.
Yes, and the general rule about that, although once again that is council specific, and it's also development officer specific as well. as a lot of things are. But with that, if you lodge plans that don't actually fit snugly into their zoning requirements, then they'll say that is outside of the zoning requirements, or that's not fully meeting the council-wide objectives. We won't stop you from building it, but we have to have public consultation to enable you to build it. And that's just covering themselves against people complaining that, hey, we read through, your zoning with a fine-tooth comb and found that building doesn't fully comply. We weren't consulted, so it covers them. Yeah, and that can, it's not a too expensive process, but but there's extra expense. Yeah, to do it with the shed.
Yeah, because I want a 5-bay shed. And
Right.
They only allow 3.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's 3, no worries.
And typically, if you've got decent neighbours, they're not too vindictive, so it's fine. Yeah. If you're doing the right thing by everybody else. Yeah. And then, so that's the first stage of planning approval, or of building development approval. The second stage is building rules consent. So that's where the council, I'll explain a bit further, that's where the council assess your building against the National Construction Code and all the Australian standards to ensure that building complies with all the building rules and limitations. Now, I say council have largely now outsourced that operation. So even all the in-house stuff is sent to people called private certifiers. So you've got companies like Tecon or Catnich Dodd also, all they do all day is assess building works against the National Construction Code, or for various, like for engineered sections, they assess that that's been engineered correctly. And so what you can do as a designer or a private individual is you can employ a private certifier yourself. So your building approval might be $400 or $500 for the council, or if it's not a major thing, it'd be like $500 with a private certifier. And if you go through that private certifier and there are still some things which are a bit on the edge, or bit unsure about, your private certifier can say, no, that's okay, that's good, or they can get back to you and say, no, something needs to be changed here. And you have that working relationship with your private certifier that you pay $400 or $500 for. And that has its benefit in that it's typically just a little bit more than it costs you for that process through the council. But when you go through the council, they can take 2-3 weeks, maybe longer, to look at your building rules consent and then say, no, it doesn't comply, and you don't get the information as to how it doesn't comply. Well, that's the worst case scenario. Best case scenario, they tell you how it doesn't comply, and then you have to sort that out and lodge it again, and they can take another month or something and get back to you and say, no, it still doesn't comply. So, having that private certifier can save you a lot of time and effort in that regard, and it speeds the process up. Because typically, because we've got, some large private certifier firms, they're probably going through one of those large ones anyhow. So building consent assessed against National Construction VCA. Important documentation for assessment of a development plan. So plans. So you need, as I said, site plan, floor plan, elevations as a minimum. For building rules consent, you will also need specifications. And the reason, does everybody know what specifications are?
You have to buy the booklet, basically.
Yeah, so it's a Word document that describes how the building is built. So in my plans, I would, my structural plans, I would include all these columns, I would include these precast concrete floors, those steel columns, etc. I'd include all that, say in a structural, and then in services plan, I would include all these things. So all of the built things as I see them are included in the plans. But for the type of carpet, say it's a, I don't really know my types of carpet actually, but let's say it's this type of carpet, this brand, this colour, this pattern, etc. I don't put that in the plans. I put all that information in the specifications. The matte acrylic finish of the walls or so, don't put that in the plans. That all goes in the specifications. So the reason we have both plans and specifications is because if we didn't have a specification, our plans just get too wordy and you just get choked up with information. But if if we didn't have, well, obviously we can't. It's very difficult to build a building without plans. Just from a specification, you can't. I guess essentially you can, but it's way too. There are many visual aspects of building to convey how it's going to be constructed. So the two work hand in hand. And a funny legal quirk is that if something is specified in the plans and also specified in the specification, and there's a difference between the two, the specification has legal precedent. So if it goes to court, the judge will say, well, the specification is a written document, and therefore what it says in the specification overrides what's drawn on the plans. But typically, a good practice is to not double up information between the two. So for all our materials and finishes, etc., specification. For all our actual building structure, building envelope, in the plans. We'll also need an engineer's report, bore logs, structural calculations, footing plan, etc. That's for building rules consent. But typically, before you go designing a building, you will want to get the soil samples and the bore logs done.
You keep going.
Yeah, that tells us all about how reactive the soil is. Well, typically, it tells us a whole bunch of things about the soil. But what we're mostly concerned with in the Adelaide metropolitan area is how reactive that soil is and whether our design is feasible. So on a really reactive site, we don't want to have many re-entry corners, so that's corners like this. So we don't want to build a house in the shape of an H or something like that with long sections that can act as fantastic levers for snapping the floor of another section with a reactive soil. The perfect building to build on a reactive site would be circular, for example, but square is good enough or rectangular is good enough.
You also, at that point, you have to have your energy efficiency reports and things like that.
Yes, you do. Yeah. Also, when it comes to building rules consent, you need to show evidence of indemnity insurance. So that'll be your builder that has indemnity insurance, unless you're a builder yourself and have your own indemnity insurance. You have to show that you've paid the Construction Industry Training Board levy, so that's a levy that's imposed on any new development to help fund things like this. Application, so you have to fill out the application forms for planning, building and development, and you have to pay the fees. Typically, both planning consent and building rules consent are done at the same time, but they don't always have to be. You can have a staged application where you get planning consent, and then when you know that it's all cool to go with what you've designed, then you go through the process of doing the engineering and the specification, which is actually in the majority of projects the bulk of the work you design. So that's a typical site plan. Well, that's a site plan is 1:500. Your more common site plans are 1:200, but when we're talking about larger sites like that, we'll put it in at 1:500, and then maybe our second page will be a 1:200 showing a more detailed area around the house and how that interacts with existing vegetation, stormwater, etc. Typical things we'll include on there will be allotment boundary, easements, adjoining boundary features if relevant, location of works and other features, inverts, so access across paths, etc. It says water table level. I've only ever included that once on a plan, so not common. Bench levels and finished floor level, yes, include that on every plan. And drainage services, and if it's if it's in a outside the metropolitan area, certainly where your septic tanks are, where your septic soakage is, or sprinkler system, or so. Any rainwater tanks. I would also add to that list driveways. I would add.
And you've got your CFS one as well. So you have to have a complete shaded area for all your CFS pathways.
Oh, yes.
5 metre boundaries around all your buildings, rainwater tanks, have a 5 metre boundary around them.
Yeah.
You've got to do it all on a map with the contours.
Yes. Yeah. And contours is another one. Yeah. To add. Yeah. In regards to the CFS requirements, that is something I'd love to cover if we've got time in this subject, because it is CFS requirements and on-site wastewater are your two big limiting features for building anywhere in the hills. And that you have to be aware of and across before you go designing for anything in the hills. Your CFS access can be a major determinant. And so if we can cover that in this subject, that'd be great. But I'll leave that for later on, because it's almost a whole lesson really. Floor plan. Typically, you show your floor plan 1:100. So that's our floor plan there. We include all our horizontal dimensions on the floor plan. We will include elevations at 1:100, and then we have all our vertical dimensions on our elevations. So how high everything is, and typically council will want to know how high everything is, because they will have it will be in their zoning how tall a building can be, etc. Or if you've got developers' encumbrances on roof slopes and things like that, then all that information needs to be included for that planning approval. Sections and construction details for building rules consent. So sections, they're able to show things like how a pipe interacts in a wall, like whether it's going to fit there, or where we put insulation, or how far a window is sitting out in a wall, how that functions. We can't really ever see any of that in an elevation, or we can see some of those things in the plan, but typically we use a section for that. Roof and wall frame layouts, footing report and soil report, engineers' calculations, and all your timber stuff, lintels, columns and beams, etc. Also, the documentation that you have to supply. You have to supply a specification. So this is for building rules consent, not for planning consent. And the timber design information. And also, one of the handy things about those timber design programs, they just spit out all the timber you specified. So previously, you'd have to be calculating it all with your span tables and writing it out neatly in a document. These are the pieces of timber I'm going to be using. Using one of those programs, it just tells you, okay, lintel 1 is this, lintel 2 is that, lintel 3 is that. Your common studs are 90 by 45. They're handy for that. So all your timber design information, that gets included, your wind classification, etc. Your tie-down calculations and bracing. So, if you understand the timber framing code, you can, if you're confident with it, you can go ahead and specify how a building is braced and do all those calculations. All the information is there to show you to do it. Or any other information requested by council. You need 3 copies of everything. So you send 3 copies to the council. They keep 2 copies. You get one back that's stamped, dated and stamped. That says these are the plans that we've approved. The reason they do that is so there can't be any conjecture later on to say, oh no, it was in the plans that we were going to do it this way. You have that copy of plans. Dated and stamped. Sorry. So private certifiers can assess development against building rules, and there are also now, not that I've ever used one, are planning consultants. So people who the council determine can make planning determinations for them. So you can employ somebody. So if you think you're going to get a hard time with council to get planning consent on something, you can employ a planning consultant to get that through as well. So those people do exist now. I've never used them, and I can't teach you much more about than that. They do exist. But private certifiers, yes. So can assess development against building rules, same function performed by council, but only building rules consent. Can assign building classification, can modify building rules application. So they say, oh look, you know, this isn't gonna fly, but this solution will, basically the same. Let's just make that amendment. And I'll do that. Cannot provide development plan consent or development approval. Must be qualified, experienced, and insured. So if you go with one of the larger firms, well, you know that that's going to be the case anyhow. Well, it's up to them anyhow. Council requires 1 day notification for inspection at the stage of excavation. So when you excavate the trenches for your footings, the reason they want to see that is because if trenches are misshapen, well, your footings are going to end up being misshapen. It's an important structural component that cannot be retrofit. Well, not easily. Steel fixed stage and concrete pour, once again, they want to ensure that, say if you've specified 16mm bars in reinforcing in your beams, that 16mm bars are going in there, and the appropriate slab mesh is going in there. They will want to see the wall frame and they'll want to see the roof frame, but not always. They need notification you're going to do these things, and then whether they pop out or not is up to them. But the big ones are the excavation and the steel before the concrete gets poured. Because once the concrete's poured, who knows what steel is in there. Builder's licensing, so you must be licensed to undertake building works, or more importantly, you must be licensed to get the indemnity insurance to undertake the building works. So that's the major limiting factor. So requirement of Building Works Contractors Act, and the builder's license is issued by the Office of Consumer and Business Affairs. Essentially, anybody can be a builder. So, you know, you can have a mate who's an accountant. If they've got enough money in the bank, they can be a builder. And if they're a good character. So you have to have a national police clearance. You can't be an undischarged bankrupt, so you can't be bankrupt. But then you also have to be able to show that you have a certain amount of money in the bank. I don't know what that money is off the top of my head, but you have to have a certain amount of money, and that I'm pretty sure that amount of money that you have as a liquid asset determines the extent of the building works you can take on as well. Like if I had $50,000 in the bank, I probably couldn't do a $5 million build. I wouldn't get, my builder's license would be, at $125,000 or something. But it's like that. So anybody can be a builder, but what you also need to have is a building works supervisor. Typically, somebody who wants to operate as a builder will also want to have that supervisor's registration, which is also issued by the Office of Consumer and Business Affairs, and that is not so easy to get. So that you need to be able to show that you have significant knowledge and experience in the works that you are carrying out. And if you want to have on your supervisor's registration like a very unlimited license, so a license to be able to build a TAFE like this, well then you have to show in an interview that you have sufficient knowledge and expertise and experience in working with all these materials and this structure, etc., and projects of this size. So it's not just about the built form, it's about workplace health and safety. Those sorts of things. So you need to, if you're going to build your own house now, you need to have a builder's license, but you also need to have a site supervisor's license. You can employ a site supervisor, but they're going to be expensive as well, because they are going to have to supervise all the building work that you do. So they're going to have to come out at various different stages, and what's that?
I don't have anyone.
No, but things have really tightened up.
Yeah.
And it has gotten really tight in this aspect. So, if you built your place 5-10 years ago, or
Started in 2014.
yeah, all right, yeah,
Finished last year.
yeah, oh, yeah, good, yeah, you sort of, yeah.
I guess I flew under the radar.
Yes, yeah. But I was speaking to a builder just a few weeks ago who offers these services, and that's his thing. He offers services to owner builders as that site supervisor. He said, look, it's just getting way too hard to offer that service. So it's really tightening
I
up.
couldn't get indemnity insurance.
Yeah, so you have to get somebody else to get indemnity insurance to cover you.
I didn't have to have it because I was building my own home.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Because
right.
there was nobody coming onto the site that
Yeah,
I had to cover.
yeah, right. Okay. Well, that might be an aspect that's still an avenue that's still available, but I don't think so. I think you think it's not.
No,
It's not
we
available.
went through it because I got told by the council, for God's sake, privately certified, don't use us. So I went private certification for the building side of it, and I have to have a registered supervisor on site.
Might depend on the council.
It's really tightened up now, and if I didn't have that building supervisor, I've got a myriad of insurances like I have.
Yes, yeah. And you have to show all those insurances before
It
you
was
get
as
builder's
of
consent.
June 2017, I think 1st June 2017 that rule came in,
Yeah,
and all the septic rules changed as well.
yeah.
That's the same thing.
Yeah, so it was recent as June 2017 that really locked down. Yeah. So that's it's quite difficult now. We're running out of time. I'll just cover this very quickly. So so the contractor's license. So that's the builder. Permits the holder of contract for building work. Knowledge of business operations. Has to be able to carry on a small business, not a war business. Must be financially viable, good character, not an undisclosed, undischarged bankrupt. Supervisor's registration. So experience and knowledge to supervise works, required nominated references, building qualifications and supervisory experience. Builder's indemnity insurance. Insurance taken out by the builder to protect the owner from non-completion of work or non-rectification of faulty works if the contractor becomes bankrupt, dies or defaults in any other way. All licensed builders are required to take out an indemnity insurance on contracts over $12,000. Construction Industry Training Board, the levy is 0.25% of the contract value, so that must be paid before building rules consent. And contract is usually in place between the owner and the builder. For domestic, your Housing Industry Association or your Master Builders Association contract normally employed. However, for commercial, the commercial contracts are drawn up in compliance with Australian Standard 2124. So they're far more variable. And that's it with 6 minutes to spare. I'll just stop.